Hello and welcome to Thick Sustainable Infrastructure Finance. I am your host, Karen Kuby, and in today's Expert View, we delve into the dangers of thin checklists. In building the bridge to a sustainable future, how critical or helpful are they? In particular, we look at LEED, Standards for Certification, the well-known and now nearly 30-year-old system developed to encourage sustainable practices in design and development by means of tools and criteria for performance measurement. We have with us one of the preeminent experts in the field, John Scofield. John is an experimental solid-state physicist with applied research interests. You might say he has a heart of an engineer and the head of a physicist. His current research interests are broadly associated with energy in buildings, energy efficiency, wind and photovoltaic power, and energy policy. He has conducted detailed studies in energy consumption, performance of two quote-unquote green buildings, the Leslie Shao-ming Sunfield Station on the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve and Oberlin College's Adam Joseph Lewis Center. In 2007 and 2008, he worked on the American Physical Society Energy Efficiency Study and is a co-author of the final report. He has recently completed a study of energy consumption by LEED commercial buildings, in which he concludes LEED certification is yielding no significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions associated with commercial buildings. A mouthful, and we kind of know where he stands on the topic. And we also have with us John Nelson, an expert, leader, and pioneer in thick sustainable infrastructure finance and engineering and science. Hello, John and John. And thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thanks, Karen.
Sure.
So John, by way of overview, you and I have been around LEED and around building performance for a good part of our careers. You, as a professor at Oberlin College, where one of the landmark original green buildings was built, which you took a careful physical look at. Me, as a practicing engineer and now an academic, responsible as engineer of record for one of the first LEED certified lab buildings. And let me begin by just saying, when I was first introduced to LEED, the notion was this was a first step. Let's get ourselves pointed towards a way of designing buildings that will make them more environmentally responsible. It struck me when I first looked at it that with a little bit of suspicion, because it was just too easy. The checklist was just too easy for me. Mm-hmm. But, you know, we went ahead through the process. My firm and with me as engineer of record, we designed Serial Building Q in Skokie, Illinois, which was the first LEED certified lab building built. And, you know, I kind of thought, well, let's just see where this goes. It is an important thing to take a first step, and maybe it isn't perfect, but let's just see where it goes. As I take that further, now I'm back at the University of Wisconsin, no longer practicing professional engineering. We've had students research this, nothing to the degree that you have done. And we've reached a few conclusions about it. And I'm just kind of wondering if what you think about this notion of, you know, a first step in a trajectory that required a lot more than just the first step.
Yeah, well, I think that the motivation behind LEED, and particularly the people who started this process, I think is very good. These are people who really wanted to design environmentally friendly buildings, and that is defined in many ways, but one of the big parts of that would be buildings that have low energy use. As we know, fossil fuels are a real source of greenhouse gas emission. And so LEED isn't all about energy savings, but it's about many things, including energy savings. And that started back about 2000, a little bit before 2000. And it was really, it has really shaped the industry. That is, for all its pros and cons, it certainly has gotten people thinking about how they make their buildings. And so in that way, it's been a very positive driver of improvement in our buildings. But I don't think it's 20 years later, it hasn't really hit the mark. It really is kind of stuck in this checklist of things you do to call a building green. And if you do all these things, then you've made a green building. But as you know, as an engineer and me as a scientist, the proof is in the pudding, that is in the tasting. And so the proof is, if you look at how much the environmental footprint of a building really is after it's built, that's how you find out if you succeeded or not. And LEED doesn't really close that loop, and it never has. And I think until it does, we're never going to really save greenhouse gas emission and energy the way we need to.
Yeah, fair enough. We conducted a research. I've got the student's thesis open here. I don't know, in 2009, I guess it was, on LEED. It was an element of curiosity for one of our master's degree students. And our conclusion was that LEED certification does not correlate positively or negatively to energy use, but it did pretty well with water in the buildings we looked at. So it had a positive effect in terms of reducing water consumption, which is important, but it had a neutral effect relative to energy at a time back then. That's when the folks who invented the stabilization wedges said we needed to cut building energy use by 50 to 80%, and LEED was cited as the means to do it. So we had that sort of reference point. That was at Princeton, right? The fellas that came up with the stabilization wedges. And so we were struck by the fact that the industry seemed to be headlong into LEED. It seemed like it had been endorsed as the gold standard for the industry, and that it would accomplish these stabilization goals, climate stabilization goals. And our conclusion was it really didn't have any impact at all. And then your research on the Lewis Center at Oberlin sort of confirmed that when I finally got a chance to see it.
Well, the first building I ever studied was the Lewis Center. I need to point out, it is not a LEED building. The Lewis Center was one of those early buildings actually before LEED was available. And so it was a very intense effort to make a green building. Had it been constructed 5 years later, I suspect it would be rated LEED Platinum, but it wasn't ever LEED rated and never has been. It's very difficult to get building energy data to find out how well buildings are performing. If you approach an owner of a building and say, I'd like to study your building, would you give me your data? The owner isn't going to let you do that unless you guarantee that you will only say nice things about the building. They just have nothing to gain if you say it wasn't designed well or it's using lots of energy. Buildings aren't like nature. Nature doesn't care what you find out. If I study, a tree, the tree doesn't care what I find out, but building owners do. And so it's very difficult to get detailed energy data. What my group has done is there's an effort around the country in large cities to benchmark data, that is to benchmark buildings, to require buildings to disclose how much energy they use to the city, so that the city can use that information to pursue its own greenhouse gas reduction efforts. And this is happening in big cities. Those data are being made public. And so we've looked at public data for thousands of buildings in 10 cities. And what we find is that and this is 20 years after LEED was introduced, that they're only saving on average about 7% in primary energy, and their reduction in greenhouse gas emission is only about 7%. And so that's nowhere near the, what do you say, 60 or 80% required if we're really going to address climate change. And it just isn't really going fast. And what's even more disturbing is we compared how many points were awarded to each of these LEED certified buildings for energy efficiency. That is, they earn points, and one of them is in the category of energy optimization. And what we found was there was almost no correlation whatsoever between the number of points earned for energy optimization and the energy saved. So even though some buildings saved a lot of energy, some didn't save any energy, some used more energy than average buildings, there was just no connection between the points awarded for energy optimization and that result. And that means you're never going to solve the problem if you don't close the loop. If you don't really have the right metric, if you're aiming for the wrong target, you're not going to save energy.
Yeah, what gets measured correctly gets improved, right? That's a pretty common axiom. Well, so we face this wicked problem of climate change and of continuing to advance human progress through buildings and through other forms of manufactured capital built works. And the normal response is let's invent a solution, and let's work that solution, and let's make that solution as ubiquitous as possible, and let's make it easy. And I think the ubiquity and the ease wound up making LEED, but not just LEED, any form of generalized checklist for how something interacts with the environment, making it something that one needs to be pretty careful about how they apply. Not necessarily all wrong, but certainly approach with a certain amount of skepticism and consideration. Don't just take it at face value. That's sort of the conclusion I draw from this discussion, and I kind of generalize it to other forms of checklists. What do you think?
I agree with that. I think that the main thing is you have to, when you're done, you have to measure the result and ask, did I achieve what I set out to achieve? And if not, let's make some changes.
And then we have the other side of the equation, which is the investment world, where people are trying to find anything to tack on, like ESG and these kind of like LEED, to kind of add value in the environmentally, the whole sustainability equation. And it's gotten a lot of traction there. These types of systems, checklists have gotten a lot of traction, and without a lot of scrutiny. And so you have a really misaligned set of incentives to stick with a system that's not great and not move to the, improving that system. And so if you were to, aside from getting municipalities to require people, building owners to report their consumption of energy, is there anything else that you would look to or suggest could happen? I mean, can the onus be put on the developers themselves to, to ascertain that the buildings that they create, the architects they use, actually do what can be done with the technologies available to ensure that it's thick, as we say here on thick sustainable infrastructure finance, that it's thick LEED instead of thin LEED as we have currently?
Well, I think the key is, do you want to reduce greenhouse? Do you want to be green, or do you want to just look green? I think that's what it comes down to. And I think that most of these companies, it's very important that they look green. That's what they want to do. And LEED has provided that. It's provided green publicity and a look of green. But the question is, do you want to actually be green? Do you want to save energy, lower greenhouse gas emission? And I think the only way to achieve that is to have actual numerical targets and say, look, you've got to hit this target if you're going to call yourself green. And if you don't hit the target, you don't call yourself green. The other thing about buildings is that you can make your building appear to use less energy by making it bigger and using the same energy, because the metric we use is energy used annually per square foot of the building. So if you build a new building that's twice as big as your old building, but uses the same energy, and everybody has more space, it will appear green by our standard. And so we need to think carefully about what metric we have. I mean, nature doesn't care about the energy per square foot. It only cares about the total. carbon emission.
Gotcha, yeah.
And that's something that we have to think about our metrics.
Yeah, following up on that, I often make an analogy to mobility where, we can measure MPG, but it's sort of irrelevant unless you also measure miles driven. You have to kind of take the two together and ultimately get the total consumption. And I always say this isn't about differential calculus, this is about integral calculus. The climate cares about quantity, not rate. Of course, it cares about rate a little because it's got a certain absorption rate, but it cares more about total quantity. Karen, back to your question, what would be a way to do this more effectively? It's occurred to me in answer to your question, John could be elected president, I could be elected vice president, we could pass a law. That's probably not going to happen. So absent that,
Let's hope it doesn't happen.
absent that, yeah, neither of us look very adept at politics. I'm just speaking for you, John, but I know I'm not.
Don't touch this.
Absent that, the entities who know this information with truth are the utilities. And utilities are regulated in the United States. So if you ask theoretically how one could use existing systems and incentivize somehow a higher standard of performance, it could theoretically be through the utilities. We've seen a little flirtation with that in California. John, I don't know how much you've worked with this, but on smart metering and on demand side management and on interruptible service, we're probably going to see more of that as the grid greens, because it will become less reliable if it's only greened with renewable energy. So there's going to have to be more provisions to have interruptions. But that's an answer to your question. There is a mechanism in place where this data exists. And it's really interesting, John, how when you talk to a utility, which maybe you do, I don't know if you do or not. When I talk to utility, they know, they just can't say, because this is all, as you know, it's private information. And that's not the kind of thing that can be released. It's like HIPAA.
Yeah, one of the, you're absolutely right about utilities being key partners in being able to do something. One of the problems with modern building design is there is a real pressure to make all electric buildings. There are people who believe that electricity can be green, and so you shouldn't use natural gas, you should use all electricity because one day it will be green. The problem is that is so far off in the future that is not a good strategy. 70% of electricity in this country is generated from fossil fuels. And you can dream all you want, but 20 years from now, it's going to be maybe 60%. It isn't going to be 20% or 10%. And so there's really a bad philosophy at work driving both LEED and a lot of things, trying to make everything electric without thinking about we don't have what it takes to make that carbon free.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's the rubric or the bromide of green the grid and electrify everything. But we've got them backwards. We're electrifying everything before we green the grid. And often people say, well, we're just going to electrify this. They're electrifying Oberlin's campus right now. One of my colleagues is doing it. And their response is, well, the grid will be green. And my response is, yeah, but all this equipment you're installing will already be in the dump by then. It'll all be recycled. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Let's get those in the right order.
Yeah,
that's the subject for another discussion on our YouTube channel. We've got a unit on firm baseload carbon-free energy as opposed to intermittent renewable carbon-free energy. And our opinion is that you don't get there without nuclear electricity, but that's not something that's favorably received right now in the United States. Although it's interesting, we're coming from Wisconsin. I'm coming from Wisconsin today, and just last week there's a new not micro but smaller nuclear reactor company in the United States. And just last week, one of the utilities here in Wisconsin started talking to them about building a baseload plant for them. So, you know, who knows? John, do you remember M. King Hubbert and peak oil?
Yes.
So M. King Hubbert, Karen, said that there'll come a point in time when you can't extract any more petroleum out of the ground. You'll reach a peak. And that actually happened in the United States. We've extended that peak by virtue of fracking and some of the technologies that we've used. And, you know, that's actually from an engineering perspective pretty cool. But the peak occurred a long time ago in the United States, and then we came back and made a few adjustments to it. So now we got a rolling peak. Anyway, the title of M. King Hubbert's paper on peak energy, on peak oil, sorry, was about nuclear electricity. The peak oil thing was just a secondary thing. He said, this is coming. We're going to need nuclear electricity. So I'm going to write a paper about nuclear electricity. He was a petroleum geologist, I think, at the time for Shell. So this isn't news. This is a story that has been told by experts for quite a while.
Indeed.
I have a question about concrete. When I think of buildings, I think of concrete. And I don't know if LEED touches on this at all or does not. Just the green versus the green aspect of CO2, you know, emissions versus just energy efficiency. Is there a part of LEED that addresses kind of more the carbon footprint?
Well, so LEED is a living thing, meaning every few years they change their standards, they revise things, and so there's always changes. And my own knowledge is always a few years out of date. I have to leave that as a starting point. But to my knowledge, LEED has not addressed carbon emission. That is, their points are about other things. They do care about using sustainable materials. And so when you assemble points to indicate how green your building is, some of those points come by you using woods from certified sustainable forests. They'll come by using certain materials, local materials, rather than materials brought in from half the world away. And then, of course, there are points for energy efficiency, but they do not address greenhouse gas emission. It's connected to energy efficiency, but it's not really addressed. And so that's something that I think LEED must address very soon.
Yeah, and Karen, interestingly, if you look at the life cycle of a building, there's a making stage, and then there are coincident using, operating, and changing stages. Making stage is really pretty short in the life of a building. If you think of a building, well, I'm sitting in a house that'll be 100 years old pretty soon. And it only took 18 months to make it. So that's maybe at the extreme end of the range, but just take a commercial building, you know, you take a few years to make it, build it, design it, and then you occupy it for decades.
Right.
The environmental footprint, the big environmental footprint is in the using, in the operating. It's not in the making. LEED is mostly about the making. It infers certain things about the using, but it doesn't actually measure them. So it's interesting because I see this happen where LEED standards are applied in the making stage, and I'll go to the party doing it and I'll say, yeah, well, maybe that gets you a point in the making stage, but it really does you harm over the life cycle of the building. So it's kind of counterintuitive, and it gets back to these wicked problems we're facing right now. What we're learning, whether it's in built works and LEED or standards like LEED, or in investments and finance like ESG, what we're learning is there's no shortcut. There's no easy button. These are things we just haven't dealt with before. We've built a complex system not considering these things. It's going to take some complexity to get out of it or to go the other way.
Well, thank you, John and John. It seems that the overriding issue with standardized checklists like LEED is that the complexities of the systems they are applied to are just broader than any checklist can actually maintain. LEED in particular seems to fail to ensure that the final building is as energy efficient as had been expected. And perhaps municipalities can play a role at helping to change that, requiring owners of buildings to report the energy use of a building. Not very likely, and particularly not in the short term, but that is a hopeful thought. And there are other trends in the making right now. But as John Scofield mentioned, it is up to us to want to make it efficient and not just look efficient, but be efficient in our energy use. If you have found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. Please feel free to contact us through this channel or by visiting our website at www.zieglercap.com/sustainability to learn more, ask questions, and engage in the dialogue. Thanks for your time today.